The book I've decided to talk about is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. With his Japanese origin, he moved to the United Kingdom with his family when he was just 6 years old. It should have been temporary but then became definitive. He abandoned the Japanese citizenship and in 1982 obtained the British one. In the early 60s, he became interested in literature thanks to his contact with the novels of Arthur Conan Doyle. When he was 20 years old, he came in contact with the novels of Dostoevsky and Charlotte Bronte, and came close to literature definitely. This novel has been his first success, whereby he received the Book Prize in 1989. It is set in the years before the Second World War, and the landlord, whose name is Lord Darlington, is an English noble who sympathizes for Hitler's Germany. The novel is written in the form of a diary, in which we can enter in close contact with its author, Mr. Stevens. He is a butler who tells his own activity mainly carried out under Lord Darlington and, at a later time, under Mr. Faraday, in the aristocratic property of Darlington Hall since the 30s. At the end of summer 1956, Mr. Stevens decides to undertake a trip in the English countryside as a result of the proposal of his second employer. At the bottom of this trip, we can notice his hidden need to visit Miss Kenton, a former governess of Darlington Hall, in order to ask her to come back to work there again. These 6 days traveling are the first real holiday of Mr. Stevens, after years of hard working. They are noticed in a sort of a diary, in which they are described in detail. It took 20 years since Miss Kenton left Darlington Hall to get married and move to Cornwall with his husband. During the whole time, the two characters used to write each other letters occasionally, and now the stuff has been dramatically reduced. Mr. Stevens hopes to convince her to come back, ending his troubled marriage. In the novel, the nature of this meeting is told giving value to professional motivations, but reading in depth, we can perceive that motivations are guided by different purposes. This novel has inspired the production of the namesake film The Remains of the Day by James Avery, in which we can observe Anthony Hopkins interpreting Mr. Stevens and Emma Thompson interpreting Miss Kenton. It is a very fair reflection of the one used in the novel, but the chronology of the events is modified in order to produce a more fluent narration. Ishiguro prepares us to the leap of time. Avery, instead, confuses the spectator, creating disorder between the present and the past time, and this makes it difficult to understand the development of actions. We can notice that there are many diversities between the book and the movie. In the book, the entire story is told by Mr. Stevens, who describes excellently both the past and the present time. In the movie, instead, the story is told by the voice of Miss Kenton. Dialogues are very abundant in words and well studied. In the novel, instead, they are more concise, even if they are strongly elaborated. In both cases, this language is extremely flowing, despite it belongs to distant times. In the novel, the scene in which Mr. Stevens asks for the trip is represented as an important event. It is seen as a turning situation to which Ishiguro dedicates few pages. The main character feels embarrassed because he thinks it is an extremely important request, and contrary to the novel, the scene in the movie has a very short duration, and the permission for the trip is given by Lord Darlington himself. We can notice that the movie tends to minimize the formality characterizing the book, and despite dialogues and events are a fair reflection of those of the book, the whole story is told in a more ironic and sliding manner. The work is basically an history of regrets and nostalgia for what they won't be able to get back. In order to understand completely the topics faced both in the novel and in the movie, it will be necessary to make an in-depth analysis of the two main characters. Mr. Stevens, he is a man with a mission to which he has dedicated his entire life, perfection. He is a man with desires he tries to repress, because he thinks they are unsuitable with the mission he wants to achieve. He is represented as a man who uses formality both in work and everyday life. His profession requires self-denials, and what is sacrificed are his personal feelings and emotions. An example of this behavior can be noticed at the moment of his father's death, which occurred at the time where Lord Darlington was holding an important meeting in the house. Mr. Stevens remains composed and doesn't allow his feeling to take over. Ishiguro guides us along a route aimed at knowing better the butler and at appreciating his dignity. The word dignity is often used in the novel. Stevens himself tries to express his opinion about it and points out how difficult it is giving a precise definition of the term. Another fundamental topic is the pursuit of excellence, seen as an obsession by Mr. Stevens. In his reflections during the trip, it's clear how his life is excessively tied to his work, so much that there isn't space for anything else. Another analysis that has to be made in order to understand better the essence of the novel is the one concerning Miss Kenton. She is completely different from Mr. Stevens. She is obstinate, stubborn, and resolute. She is very proud of her work, but presents a characteristic that makes her different from her colleague: independence. Miss Kenton has a strong moral sense, but she is able to recognize his fragility. She also loves Mr. Stevens, but her feelings are repressed again. She is a woman extremely attached to her work, looks for human contact, and has passions she can't hide. The novel addresses deep and conflicting issues. The topic which embodies the novel at its best is the relentless passing of time, realized thanks to the frequent use of flashbacks. The action is fixed, static, and the only sense of motion is given by the memories of the butler and his trip. I've decided to propose this novel because it faces current topics, even if it is set in ancient times. Reading the book, we experience different feelings, especially because of Mr. Stevens' behavior. We admire him for his professionalism and his dedication to his work, but at the same time, we feel pity for him because he is a man who has never been able to express himself and his feelings. We have to recognize the complexity of managing a movie taken from a book mainly made by reflections. It is a typical English movie, very sluggish, intense, and characterized by a subtle irony, which sometimes turns into memorable scenes. The final scene perfectly embodies the essence of the novel. We can see Mr. Stevens closing the windows of Darlington Hall, while a bird, who was just before entrapped in one of its rooms, flies away. This makes it clear how Mr. Stevens belongs to that place and how he continues choosing to belong to it.